Hello and welcome. It's September 2025 in New York City, 80 years after the founding of the United Nations. World leaders, diplomats and advocates step onto the blue carpeted chambers of UN headquarters, that monstrous anti-human head of globalism's venomous serpent. Outside, the conversation is louder than usual and sharper. Inside, an ancient satanic agenda deceitfully promises renewal, progress, and cooperation. Outside, the questions are harder. Who sets the terms of centralised global governance? Who benefits? And who gets a say? This episode looks squarely at the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly, UNGA 80, through the same objective lens shared by critical thinkers everywhere. Concerns about legitimacy, transparency, and the pace and direction of globalism's greenwashed 2030 agenda for sustainable development. My purpose here isn't to rehash dog-eared talking points. It's to examine the aims, the timetable, and the friction between promise and practice. UNGA is the world's annual diplomatic town hall. Every member state gets a voice, and this year carries the symbolism of an 80th and oak anniversary. On paper, UNGA 80 is contrived to rekindle momentum behind the 2030 agenda, the SDGs, and the shore-up cooperation amid fabricated global crises. Here are the anchor dates to watch. The 80th session opened on 9th of September 2025. Commemorative events and the SDG moment was 22nd of September. High-level general debate, 23rd to the 27th and 29th of September. Biennial Summit for Financing Development and the Climate Summit, 24th of September. Thematic meetings on Palestine, women's rights, youth, AI governance, and nuclear disarmament, 22nd and 26th of September. Conference on Rohingya Muslims and minorities in Myanmar, 30th of September. That's the official calendar. The question underneath is larger. Can a sprawling, top-down agenda convincingly answer bottom-up concerns about sovereignty, accountability, and everyday realities? A growing percentage of the global public are increasingly sceptical of the UN's capacity, reach, and in many quarters its undeclared but menacingly obvious intentions. While globalist trolls frame the UN as the only universal forum where states can deliberate without war, critics see an institution exclusively focused upon centralisation, insulated from local consent. In 2025, the trust gap has become a yawning chasm. Global mass migration pressures, digital surveillance debates, central bank digital currencies, digital ID frameworks, and the relentless expansion of executive authority, national and international. They all feed a single anxiety, that decision-making covertly slithers from citizens into a technocratic centre. On the streets and online, we see that anxiety expressed as protest, satire, and hostile rejection of the UN's woke language of inclusive multilateralism. Many civil society groups argue that the Agenda 2030 project has overpromised and under-delivered, and that the rhetorically greenwashed cover of universal goals cunningly obscure highly political trade-offs hidden from the public eye. So let's talk results. The SDGs are vast, 169 targets across 17 goals. Depending on the methodology you trust, assessments in recent years have suggested that fewer than 1 in 5 targets are on track globally, with many either stalling or moving backward. Even generous readings paint a sobering picture. Development gains are uneven. Absurd climate pledges frequently miss milestones, and inequality within and between countries remains stubborn. Why does this matter? Because the gap between promise and delivery erodes credibility. When leaders convene to accelerate action without concrete, verifiable improvement, the language of acceleration rings hollow. Critics hear a familiar pattern, a cycle of declarations and summits, thin on enforceable accountability. If the SDGs are the scoreboard, then the numbers call for humility, course correction, and greater scrutiny, not just more headlines and hashtags. Inside the building, UNGA 80's agenda is dense. Beyond the general debate, the Financing for Development Summit and the Climate Summit converge on a central question: who pays and who decides how resources flow? Expect proposals for blended finance, debt relief mechanisms, and climate adaptation funds, mechanics designed to mobilise trillions. In parallel, thematic meetings on AI governance, women's rights, Palestine, nuclear disarmament, youth engagement, and the Myanmar minorities crisis underscore the UN's stated mission: peace, prosperity, rights, and sustainability. These are consequential forums. Substantive issues deserve substantive deliberation. Outside, though, the narrative is very different. Demonstrators and digital critics warn that the policy mix cements top-down architectures, financial and technological, that concentrate and centralise power. CBDCs and digital IDs are flashpoints. Proponents frame them as tools for inclusion and efficiency. Opponents fear surveillance, control, and the marginalisation of dissent. Trust us is not a governance model, and assurances of safeguards fall flat without independently verifiable checks and balances. This is the major fault line of UNGA 80, the tension between institutional ambition and public consent. We're 5 years from the 2030 marker. Supporters of the agenda see urgency, a shrinking window for panic-driven climate action, compounding shocks in food and health systems, and a fragile multilateral order that needs, in their words, renewal, not retreat. Critics air a different urgency: democratic accountability. They note that development frameworks, no matter how benevolent their cosmetic rhetoric, make distributive choices, winners and losers, industries amplified and industries constrained, speech norms codified and policed. Without robust public participation, real debate, not performative consultation, grand designs are quiet revolutions against local autonomy. The truth is that urgency and accountability are not enemies, but they do pull on the same rope. If UNGA 80 is to be more than an anniversary show, it must treat public trust as a first-order outcome, not a communications challenge. The UN's legitimacy has always rested on a hybrid promise: a world where sovereignties are respected, even as shared problems are managed together. Over time, the scope of shared problems expanded from war and famine to emissions, data, and algorithmic risk. Each expansion demanded coordination tools that increasingly become centralised governance, standard bodies, funding conditions, cross-border compliance regimes. For some, that's evolution in a connected world. For others, it's dangerous drift. The deeper the coordination, the more urgent the question. Where is the consent? Not just state consent, but citizen consent. That's where the trust gap becomes existential. It's not only whether goals are laudable, it's about how decisions are made, who sits at the table, and whether ordinary people can verify and contest what unelected elites have decided in their name. If you're following along this week, here's a practical lens for the headlines. Specificity over slogans. Are financing commitments tied to measurable, time-bound outcomes with independent audits? Do climate pledges include enforceable milestones, not just net zero rhetoric? Openness over choreography. Are negotiations and drafts accessible? Are dissenting expert views included or sidelined? How are decisions communicated? Press release first, documentation later, or the other way around? Governance of the digital layer. In AI governance sessions, listen for how rights, redress, and democratic oversight are operationalised. On digital IDs and CBDCs, scrutinise privacy by design opt-out pathways and the separation of identity, payments, and surveillance functions. Conflict and peace. In meetings on Palestine, the test is concrete de-escalation measures and humanitarian access, not just statements of concern. In Myanmar, look for commitments that centre minorities' safety and long-term political inclusion. Speech and civil space. Watch whether calls for information integrity become pretexts for censorship. Robust counter-speech and due process are democratic guardrails. If transparency improves and the metrics become real, well, that's a signal. If not, expect the trust gap to widen exponentially. The protests and the online critiques aren't a sideshow. They're a diagnostic. They tell us where systems are failing to persuade. And when citizens sense choreography instead of candour, or feel that the future is being settled behind glass, then they withdraw consent. That withdrawal can be quiet, apathy, disengagement, or loud. Marches, investigative citizen journalism, whistleblowing, litigation. The point isn't that opposition is always right, it's that opposition is a democratic data point. If Agenda 2030 is to be legitimate, its builders must demonstrate not just efficiency, but humility. Listening that changes outcomes, not just listening that improves messaging. UNGA 80 isn't just a commemorative number. It forces a reckoning. A race to 2030 without credible public buy-in becomes a race to nowhere. Targets missed, trust spent, cynicism entrenched. But a pivot towards transparency, measurable delivery, and genuine participation could reset the story. There's a line worth repeating. Urgency does not absolve accountability. In fact, the more urgent the claims, the more robust the accountability must be. That's the only way complex systems earn, not demand, consent. As globalist shills parrot greenwashed propaganda at the podium this week, remember the two rooms of UNGA 80. One is the chamber, the slippery language of partnership, multilateralism, and accelerated action. The other is the street and the digital commons, language of skepticism, sovereignty, and the insistence that governance is not something that happens to people, but with them, or not at all. Which room will shape the next 5 years? Well, that may depend on less on what's declared, on more on what's actually demonstrated. Audited results, procedural openness, and the simple democratic right of answering hard questions with specifics. We'll be watching. we invite you to do the same. Read primary documents, compare pledges to baselines, and carefully monitor how power is exercised, not just how it's described. Because the legitimacy of global cooperation has to rest on more than anniversaries. It must rest on informed consent. Right now, this is something the UN does not have from the global community, and given its current trajectory, never will have. It's fervently hoped by an increasingly aware and vigilant society that this realisation will serve as the decisive moment to sever the UN from humanity. If you found this episode useful, please share it, debate it, and send us any documents and data you might think we should see. This global conversation continues outside the glass. And thank you for watching.